So I'm going to just start, give you a little brief history of my involvement in this work. Right when I finished my training, around 1980, I discovered a way to give MDMA to my patients legally if I made it myself in California. This is before it was illegal. So I made a batch with Sasha Shulgin in this lab, and for 5 years, my wife, a psychiatric nurse, gave MDMA to about 80 people. Nobody with serious problems because it was too risky back then. And then, of course, we had to stop because it became scheduled in '85. And then in 1993, the Heffter Research Institute was formed. We're named after Arthur Heffter, who isolated mescaline from peyote in Germany in the late 1800s. He was a chemist. And we were 5 scientists, doctors, no money. You know, we started 25 years ago. And gradually over those years, we've contributed to the publication of about 110 published scientific papers, which we're very proud of. And for most of the last 15 years, we've been focused on psilocybin research. And we sort of started in conjunction with MAPS. We all met each other in the mid-'80s at Esalen Institute. And so we're a lot of cross-pollination there. So MAPS focused on MDMA, Heffter on psilocybin. The biggest, so far the most important papers studies we funded, this is all private funding because the government has not directly funded any psychedelic research since the early 70s at least. Two studies with psilocybin for cancer patients with depression or anxiety. And they were published in December 2016. And that provided enough evidence for FDA to give the go-ahead to go in the final phase 3 to approve psilocybin as a treatment in this country. And out of that, one of our board members, Bill Linton, founded the USONA Institute. And we share a couple of board members. And USONA is doing all the phase 3 work for psilocybin. Because Bill is the founder CEO of Promega Corporation, which is the largest privately held biotech company in the world. And so he has some resources, and he knows how to run a business, and he has people who's work for drug companies and chemists all right there in Madison, Wisconsin. So he was really set up to do this FDA, regulatory compliance project, which they're getting ready to start pretty soon. So I'm going to describe just the different aspects of the research that's going on now and where it's at, and I'll take some questions after each section. So most people want to know, when will MDMA and psilocybin be approved by FDA? When is that going to happen? And of course it's never been tried before, but most people, their timelines are 2022 ballpark, give or take a couple of years. That's how it looks right now. And MAPS is about to start their phase 3. They're ramping up right now. They have about 15 sites, I think. And Rick Doblin's speaking here on Friday, I believe, and he can give you lots of details on that. With the MDMA, they have 15 sites to do that, and are starting lots of training therapists. They want to train 5,000 therapists. And so a couple of months ago, they asked me to do a training site, since I've actually given it to people before. So I'll be training therapists where I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, within a few months. So it's very exciting for me personally because I haven't been able to do this in 33 years. So let me talk about, so MAPS really has been focused on the MDMA for PTSD. That's, the single thing they've been pushing for a long, long time. And then USONA's doing the psilocybin. It will be for major depression, anyone with major depression. And the way that will work, when it is approved, we all expect it'll be restricted to clinics whose therapists and psychiatrists have gone through an approved training program, approved by FDA. The drug will never leave the clinic. No one will go home with psilocybin or MDMA. and everybody will be screened, lots of therapy, treatment. The cost of the drug is a very tiny part of the cost of the whole treatment because there's so many hours of therapy. The Mdma therapy is very complicated, very intense, because PTSD is a very complex disorder, and so there's a lot of interaction when they're in that fear-reducted state, so they can process, talk about their trauma, and release it. Psilocybin is more altering of the consciousness than MDMA. So there's not really very much interaction during a psilocybin session. People are just, in both settings, they're lying down with headphones and eye shades, but there's more coming out and talking with MDMA. But psilocybin, they're just inside, and if about a fourth of the people have anxiety during the session, so the therapists are there to support them and help them through that anxiety. And by the end of the sessions, the anxiety is always resolved. So before I get into this, other studies that are happening now for other things, any questions about phase 3 psilocybin MDMA that people want to ask? Yes, in the back.
Hey George, it's Eric Davis. Good to see you.
Hi.
This is slightly. Hold on just a second. Okay.
Thank you. This is slightly tangential, so if you don't want to address it now or you don't want to address it, that's fine.
Okay.
But just because you're here, I would love to hear what USONA thinks about Compass and some of the stresses over how this regulation and approval process is going to happen vis-a-vis the difference between nonprofit and for-profit organizations. So again, I know it's slightly
No, that's
tangential,
fine, yeah.
but it's important, and it's just even to explain what Compass is important.
Yeah, okay,
Thanks.
yeah, so, okay, yeah, thanks for bringing it up, Eric. Compass is so MAPS is nonprofit, USONA is nonprofit, Heffter is nonprofit. Compass is a for-profit corporation based in England, and their main plan is to get psilocybin approved for treatment-resistant depression in Europe. And so, I know them and have had a lot of contact with them in the past, and there has been, especially a year ago, a lot of drama, soap opera, emotions, feelings about for-profit, non-profit. Everybody has, it's sort of a emotional trigger issue. And at first, I think people were afraid that somehow if Compass started their research first or got there first, that could somehow prevent USONA from getting psilocybin approved, which is completely false. After we looked at the regulations, to be a little technical, if say Compass gets their psilocybin approved by EMA, or in this country FDA, they want to do it here too, no one can use their data to get, say, a generic psilocybin approved for 5 years. But USONA is creating their own data. So there could be 100 organizations doing phase 3 studies for the same drug, and they all get it approved. So it looks like there will be 2 psilocybin products available. So there's no threat either way. And then a lot of people have, including me, different feelings about just the whole concept of for-profit corporation, which involves shareholders that are not really involved in the work or maybe not understand it, just investors, and versus nonprofit where it's all, there's no profit. And USONA's plan is to sell psilocybin to the patients/doctors at the cost of producing it. So they will not make any profit, and all the money they put in the research is all through donations. And when Bill Linton formed USONA about 4 years ago, he said his concept was, this is our gift to humanity. We're giving them this medicine, and we're not going to make a profit of it, and that's just the mindset, and so that's the plan. And I can speak personally, and this is nothing about Compass or the people involved, but personally, having worked with people in this setting, the important factors in psychedelic therapy are the mindset of the person, the setting, the situation where the journey happens, and the drug and the dose. So if I imagine myself, I'm depressed, I'm taking psilocybin, and your mind could get very sensitive to very subtle things in that state. And so when I imagine myself in that state, like, well, where did this drug come from, and where's my money going, and if it's for profit, what are they going to spend their money on? Are they spending money on sustainable stuff? These are concerns I have. So that affects my mindset, which affects my journey. And you're nodding your head like, yeah, duh. And so to me, it's just a beautiful thing to offer it, essentially as a gift, just at cost. But I'm definitely not saying that people won't get treated well in a for-profit model at all, because the therapists are doing the therapy's the same. So that's just a personal feeling, and everybody who thinks about this issue has their own attitudes, beliefs, judgments, etc. about it. So did that answer, Eric, pretty much? Okay. Any other questions about the phase 3 level?
Hi, thank you. I missed the beginning, but just this, what you sort of ended on was how people in the psilocybin treatment some people might have anxiety during the session, but then that always kind of dissipates. Is that always, or just sort of just a little? I would love a little bit more elaboration on that.
I know for sure in the 2 studies with cancer patients, nobody had problematic anxiety by the end of the day. That's not to say that's never going to happen, because everybody's so different. But that was 80 people, and they were in the 3 cancer studies, one a long time ago, and I've just not heard of any of our research subjects in all our studies being in an anxious or disturbed state at the end of the day. Yeah, because when they come down, then there's integration time, talking, and they get the person in good shape so before they leave the site. Yeah.
Thank you. So one thing I'm wondering, with the phase 3 studies, are you looking at completely screening anyone for any comorbidities, anything like that?
Yes, yeah. So for pretty much all Mdma psilocybin research, if there's a history, or in some studies even a family history, immediate family history of schizophrenia, any kind of psychosis that wasn't drug-induced, or a manic episode, they are excluded from the studies. And so that's very important. And there's different studies have a whole long list of medical exclusion, like if you have a brain tumor or dementia or all sorts of medical things. But definitely mental health, manic episode or psychosis, you cannot be in the study. And so for the inclusion criteria for psilocybin, it's you have a diagnosis of major depression. For the MDMA, it's PTSD. And I think they're focused on the more severe PTSD for the MDMA. So that's in a nutshell. But is there a follow-up to that? Or?
Yeah. Any exclusion for substance use disorders?
Yes. If there's a current substance use disorder, and they would be excluded, and they do urine drug screens on the morning of the session. So if there's any, illicit substance in their urine, they would not have the session that day. They can, caffeine, nicotine is not a problem, but there's cocaine or other illicit drugs, they would not be able to have the session that day. So do the urine drug screen pregnancy test in the morning of the session.
You mentioned that a lot of the patients are already diagnosed with anxiety and depression. What about interactions with anxiety and depression medications? Is there any concern with that? I have some friends who are on antidepressants and are concerned about the effects of psychedelics on that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So to be in both MDMA and psilocybin, you cannot be on an antidepressant when you have the session. So people have to taper off and where the drug is completely gone, which is usually considered 5 half-lives of the drug. And SSRI drugs like Prozac actually inhibit the effect of psychedelics, so that would decrease the effect of them. And the same, and MDMA and psilocybin both. So they have to be off all psychiatric medicines. I think some things are allowed if they, if they're a cancer patient. I think opiates are maybe allowed a little bit if they're in severe pain. They can continue that. I think it depends very specific, but definitely not any psychiatric medicine.
I don't know if this is related still, but is there any danger, or is it just that the studies would be less effective? But is there any danger in like psychedelic, like psilocybin or LSD with antidepressants?
Not a physiological danger. My concern would be what is the underlying mental disorder? Is it going to be helpful or not? Et cetera. But certainly with ayahuasca, which has a MAO inhibitor, that would definitely contraindicated with the psilocybin and MDMA and depressants, Prozac and stuff. But that's not really a concern here. Okay.
So for the last 3 years, I've been trying to help someone who's very dear to me, a relative who was in the US Marines and Navy for 30 years. And MAPs have been incredibly helpful, and we got him on a ketamine therapy session because he was deemed to be too fragile for Mdma therapy. And he had an incredible breakthrough, and it lasted about a week, and then he relapsed. And I've been speaking with a Swiss psychedelic therapist, Frederica Michael Fischer. She's given a lot of advice, and she believes in some cases when the trauma is so deep and they're unresponsive to psychedelic therapy, that the only way she sees to treat these people is by literally replacing every cell in their body, perhaps via stem cell therapy. Is this something that you...
I've never heard of that, so I just know nothing about it. I've evaluated a lot of PTSD patients at a treatment center, but I'm not an expert on PTSD research, and I've never heard anything like that, so I have no idea.
How long do people usually stay in the treatment? Like he said, his relative relapsed. Is there like a danger of that when they stop treatment?
Well, the treatment it's just one treatment. Sometimes it's like the cancer studies was one single psilocybin session with therapy before and after. MDMA is 3 sessions with therapy before and after. That's one course of therapy. At this point, there's no concrete plan for repeating a few months later or whatever, because so far, the cancer studies, they collected data for 6 months and nobody relapsed. Or no, some did relapse, but most did not. And, in research, it's totally rigid. You have to follow the protocol. It's too complicated to add for relapse. So that, once it's approved, then we'll learn about that. It's just we don't know now.
Sorry, also, are they excluded if they already take MDMA or psilocybin?
It depends on the study. Some studies exclude people with prior experience and some don't, depending on what they're studying. Okay. So let me. Are these questions about the phase three for psilocybin and MDMA? Because I'm going to take more questions as we go along. Okay. So let me talk about. So Heffter's already sort of like passed the baton on psilocybin approval off to USONA. So what we're focused on now is psilocybin treatment for other problems other than depression. And the main thing we've been focused on is addiction. Because there were 2 pilot studies of just 10 or 15 people who were smokers and alcoholics that showed very dramatic improvement The alcoholics got 2 psilocybin sessions, the smokers 3. The smokers were like 80% improvement rate, which is double or higher than the best treatment available. The psilocybin for the cancer patients, anxiety, depression was going to like about 70% or so, 70 to 80% improved. And one session, and for 6 months, they were still doing much, much better. And there's just, that's completely unprecedented in psychiatry. You take a drug once, even with some therapy, and your symptoms are better for months. So this is, we consider it's a new model and breakthrough, and it probably involves some neurobiology as well as psychology and experience. So what's happening right now from those pilot studies, there's a study at Johns Hopkins University with smokers, and the one group is just doing nicotine patch, other groups doing just one psilocybin session, both with a lot of therapy designed to help people quit smoking. And they're about halfway through. That'll be done in about 3 years. And so far the reports are it's looking good. Not as good, probably not as good as the first study that had 3 psilocybin sessions, but they're still definitely showing improvement, so that's looking good. And for alcohol, they're doing this clinical trial at NYU with 50 patients in each group, and their active placebo is Benadryl. Benadryl in one group, and then psilocybin in another group. But if people get the placebo group, after the 6 months of data collection, they can have a psilocybin session where they know it's psilocybin, so that they get the treatment. They just have to wait 6 months to get it. And there's 2 purposes of that. One, to just provide the treatment to them, and 2 is a motivator to help them stay in through the whole data collection period, to stay involved in the study and not drop out, because it's about $20,000 for each research subject. This costs about $20,000. So you don't want to have people drop out of your studies. And that also is looking very good now. And then we gave partial support to a study that's happening now at the University of Alabama in Birmingham for cocaine addicts. And this is very interesting because most of the other studies have been sort of middle class people, educated, college educated people, etc., in big cities, New York, Baltimore, etc. But the Alabama cocaine study is usually very poor, low education, African American cocaine addicts. And so they're in the middle of their study, and they have 2 groups. It's a small study, but we've gotten some reports, just verbal reports about little cases, and what impresses me is that the music they're hearing is this romantic classical music that Stan Grof used, 40 years ago. It's the same playlist, this romantic classical music, and Johns Hopkins uses this. And so, but these are like largely, poor African American people who probably didn't hear a lot of classical music, but they're having peak mystical experiences, turning their lives around. And to give you a couple examples, there's one woman, she was basically living in a crack house, not signed up for any welfare, not getting any benefits, just completely addicted, living in a crack house. And so after her treatment, she moved out, went to social services, got support, got housing, got out of the world of cocaine addiction and that culture and people, and started creating a life for herself. And then there was another, a man, and he said, after a session, his follow-ups, I guess, he was saying, well, I used to like, I'd drive down the street, I'd like look at women, I'd whistle at women, and now see, that's not right. I shouldn't do that. I'm just be cool. That's what I learned, be cool. So that subculture, which is different from like white, upper middle class culture, they're still benefiting. The treatment is still working for this very different cultural group, which is very inspiring to me, because people like that need a lot of help. So those are all looking very good. The other addiction study we want to start, that we're about to start, we just need a little bit more money, is opiate addiction, which of course is a big issue these days. And when LSD was used to treat heroin addiction in some people in not an organized way, but in the 1960s, and it did help people get off heroin. And so in a way, what Heffter is doing with psilocybin, in a way, is sort of repeating what was done with LSD, but at the current research standards, because LSD was very helpful for addiction, and it was very helpful for particularly alcoholism, and very helpful for people with terminal cancer and emotional distress around that. So we're picking the winners, the low-hanging fruit to start this, because it's very expensive. Or opiate addiction, that's a lot more tricky, because if people, so they have their experience, they have their therapy, they get clean from opiates, they're sober, abstaining, not taking anything. If they have an accidental relapse, accidental overdose is fairly common, and they could die if they had a relapse and took too much, especially something like fentanyl or just got the dose wrong. So to do it safe, because if someone takes opiate takes psilocybin and they die, that's not going to be helpful for this whole research direction. So the strategy, after consulting with a lot of addiction specialists, is we're going to only start doing a safety drug interaction study with opiate addicts who have already withdrawn from their drug abuse and are maintained on Suboxone or buprenorphine, which is currently basically the standard treatment for opiate addicts, just to stay on Suboxone ongoing, and that prevents withdrawal. And Suboxone has another drug in it. It's two drugs that if they try to use heroin or something, they won't get high from it. They won't have an effect from it. And so they can live, they can function, and they take this every day. So there is evidence in animals that opiates diminish the effect of psychedelics. So one question is, well, what dose of psilocybin will opiate addicts need who are taking Suboxone? Because Suboxone, it's a partial opiate agonist. So we need to find what dose to use is going to be effective. We also need to find out, are there some unexpected drug interactions between these two drugs that could cause some adverse event that just we don't know about, because it's never been done before. So the first study is just a very small safety drug interaction study to see are there any adverse events. Does it, very unlikely, does it trigger withdrawal from Suboxone? Does it increase the effect of Suboxone and lower the respiration? Just covering all the bases. And that will be at the University of Wisconsin. So we're very excited about that. And so those are the addiction studies. So I'll take questions about addiction studies now from people.
Hi. You've got a lot of stakeholders in this, in these studies, and drugs are usually classified very generally. People talk about drugs, and obviously using psychedelics to treat other drug addictions is something that people who are not educated about drugs don't think about. How do you start changing that culture about separating different types of drugs, and whose mind do you need to change the most to actually be able to use them more broadly?
That's a great question, because it is a real problem. The National Institutes of Health consist of all the government agencies that fund scientific research for health. And the Agency for Drug Abuse, NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, Nora Volkow is a director, and some of our researchers have direct relationships with her, and they've talked to her, and the word is she just doesn't seem interested in learning about it or doing it. And it, like you say, for someone who's a very mainstream addiction scientist, it's counterintuitive to give a drug of abuse to treat a drug of abuse. And that's, like you say, they're not educated that this psychedelics have nothing to do with heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, blah, blah, blah. And then alcohol, this is kind of a negative story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. The alcohol study, they wanted to do fMRI scanning of their subjects before and after the psilocybin session, and applied to National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Addiction, I think it is, NIAAA, for a grant just to do the scanning. No psilocybin, just the scanning. It got a perfect score from all the scientific reviewers, absolutely perfect score scientifically, but the director of that agency said, we're not going to do that because we're not going to give a Schedule I drug to treat alcoholism, just because I say so. So that's where it begins. So how do you get beyond that? So our overall strategy is to fund studies with private money to create data, enough data, that the data, it speaks for itself, and eventually, hopefully, I mean, sooner or later, you know, the public will demand that the government support, because people need these treatments because, you know, depression, addictions, there's a lot of people who aren't getting fully treated. There's still a lot of untreatable people. So our philosophy, we're scientists, we're a scientific institute, we're not an advocacy organization, so in that way we're different from MAPS. We just do scientific research. So that's our strategy to produce data that's just you can't argue with, and then that's reported in the media. You know, these cancer studies on the front page of the New York Times. And the tremendous public attention and media, and then this recent book, Michael Pollan, you know, he's talked about this research. There's books coming out, and it's good for the media, tons of media in the last, say, 3 years or so. So all that, you know, research data, and then patients speak to journalists and tell their personal story, because a personal story really, people connect with a personal story as opposed to numbers in a graph, you know, most people. And so I think those personal stories are making a difference. And a lot of people who work for government agencies, I was talking to Rick Dunn the other day, it's like they're going to give a talk to the annual meeting of the chiefs of police for trauma for police officers. You know, so these sort of very mainstream organizations are getting interested, you know, and veterans, you know, the VA won't do it, but the veterans want the PTSD treatment. There's 20,000 people want to be in the Mdma phase 3 study, and there'll only be 200 or 300 spots. So the demand is just off the chart. So scientific data, media reports, public pressure, and, you know, administration, politics, etc. That's how we think about addressing that.
This is actually going back to PTSD. We know that there's evidence that Black people who experience racism a lot have lower life expectancy and a higher risk of health problems because of the effects of being discriminated against. And I was just wondering if you know of any studies that have helped minorities, you know, sort of, I don't know, like heal from that?
No, there have not been studies specifically for that. And I mean, the problem is, again, this is all privately funded, so we can only afford to do the most highest priority studies for the most people who have the most drastic need. And it turns out that the cocaine study in Alabama it turns out there's a lot of African Americans in that study because that's the population that lives there that has the cocaine addiction. So I don't know how many is African American, how many Anglo or, you know, white or whatever. So, but there are a lot more African Americans in that study than any of the other studies that have been done, just because that's the location and the problem. Yeah. But obviously, there's so many things that need to be studied. You know, it's been 100 times as much as being spent now.
Okay, I got it. So I was wondering if you know of any like biomarker-based studies in terms, or like any biomarkers that are going along with like the psilocybin or MDMA study. I know that Imperial College has done like fMRI-based biomarkers, but if there's anything else that could sort of maybe help convince you know, NIDA the NIMH that there is something going on here?
Yeah, that's a sophisticated and a good question. Let me think of it, because it's not. In these treatment studies, not so much now. And I know that in is Ben Kelmindy in the room? Anyway, Ben Kelmindy, he's camped here. He is a psychiatric researcher at Yale, and he's about to start a study on the mechanism of action of MDMA for PTSD to try to understand the biological mechanism of how, because PTSD has biological markers and stuff. And do some of those change with MDMA, and what changes? And I don't know the details of this study to answer that question. For the psilocybin treatment studies, not so much. In Switzerland, Franz Vollenweider in Zurich, who's in our organization, does a lot of fMRI research. So you could consider that a biomarker in a sense, which networks are reactivated, diminished, etc. 3D EEG, PET scans in the past. There's a lot of biological measurements are done with normal people with these medications, but so far for the treatment studies, it just adds to the cost, and we just want to just get the data. And
corollary to the previous question about when you have individuals who aren't aware of the value potentially of these. For example, all the institutional review boards, how are you actually getting the science to even be initiated at a lot of these centers?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Every university that starts this program, it's a long process, working personally with the administrators, the deans, etc. NYU, Hopkins took a long time to get used to it. A lot of back and forth with the university IRBs. An IRB is an institutional review board, and all Heffter research is done at medical schools, and so that each medical school has committee that decides that this human subjects are protected, it's going to be safe, it makes sense, the risk benefits make sense. So every study has to pass its local institution's IRB, we call it. So it takes a lot of hand-holding, a lot of time, back and forth, there's drama around it, but eventually they come around. And now, at this point, there's enough positive data that it's easier to convince the hospital administrators. So Yale University is the latest major university to join this. And so I'm going to, was there other questions on addiction? But I'll segue into this if not. Addiction?
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. You were just saying that these studies seem to be showing that this can help a lot with addictions, with alcoholism, etc., but we don't know why. You probably have a theory, and you probably talk to scientists and other researchers who believe they know why, but don't want to say it in public. Can you give us some insights?
Oh, no, I'm happy to talk about theories. Yeah. So because we talked about this a lot. So most everyone believes it's both a psychological effect, subjective psychological, psychotherapeutic effect, and a neurobiological effect. And in addiction, is generally, well, the psychological effect is not that hard to understand. You're on a psychedelic, you're way out of your normal mode of thinking about yourself, your personality, your life, your habitual thoughts about identity. You're just way back, and you're beyond individuality. So as people transition back, they have perspective in their life, and it's pretty classic for an addicted person to say, like, I'm destroying myself. This is like stupid, and they like get it. The denial can't be denied anymore. The denial defense. And on our website, there's a woman I interviewed. She was alcoholic, and she said she was going to sign her husband up for the study, but it turns out she qualified. She just insidiously drank more and more and more every day, gradually became more distant from her children, and realized it. In her first psilocybin session, she just cried the whole time. She couldn't visualize her children. It was really emotionally very, very painful for her for hours. So that was her wake-up call. Or you could say, in addiction, there's like the phrase hitting bottom. Alcoholic, it's like they're in the gutter, they're drunk, and they're throwing up, and it's like, okay, I hit bottom, I got to get sober, you know. So it's that kind of thing, except safer. So she hit bottom. Her second psilocybin was colors, light, joy. Her children are with her. We're all going to God together, you know. And afterwards, in her interview, she says, so I was playing with my kids, and they're playing football, and I was running around, and they went like, we're like, you know, elementary school kids. It's like, Mom, you never played with us like this for a long time. She says, no, I played with you. They said, yeah, but you never ran. So she's more involved with her children, and she's off alcohol, at least the last time we talked to her 14 months later. She's actually grew up in like in a Christian cult where they sewed her clothes, very, she's an Hispanic woman in Albuquerque, but very sort of cultish Christianity. And so she went back to, and she studied other things, but she went to her evangelical Christian church, her community. You know, this is not the, you know, tell everybody what to do, it's just share the love of Christ, etc. kind of church. And, you know, so that's her support group instead of a 12-step program. So she's more involved with her religious community. She's more involved with her children. But it was a very painful wake-up call, that first session. But also there are some theories just purely mechanistically in the brain, the serotonin 2A receptor and all the neurons are connected and the addiction centers. You know, there's hypotheses and theories that could explain why a psilocybin experience would sort of lower the addiction pattern in the brain, but it's just a theory at this point.
Addiction? Yes, okay.
Recovering addict, 28 years clean and sober, doing abstinence, 12-step meditation, etc. Strong interest in psychedelics, but sometimes feel like it's too much of a risk to plunge me back into obsessive-compulsive overuse of substances. Wondered if you have any studies that have shown people then who are in recovery relapse because of trying a psychedelic means for therapy, or is it fairly safe? You know, the numbers, the percentages, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, so far in the addiction studies, no one has like gone out and started taking a lot of mushrooms.
I was thinking of that. My primary drug was crack cocaine, marijuana, alcohol.
Yeah, no. So the people in addiction studies, they're like, you know, alcohol is like 2/3 of them just their heavy drinking days was the primary outcome. They're not like totally abstinent, but the heavy drinking days are like 2/3 reduced or 70% reduced. And I have not heard any evidence that they're using other drugs or gone to other drugs, you know, et cetera. So there's just no evidence that happens. I mean, I can't advise you personally, but well, we can a little more time. Let me segue into other research. So Yale University, as I mentioned, is now supportive. Their chairman of psychiatry, and it's a very prestigious institution, and they're starting a psilocybin study for obsessive-compulsive disorder. Just a larger study than was done in Arizona about 10 or 15 years ago. And they're doing a study with Mdma, mechanism of action for PTSD. They're studying psilocybin both for migraine headaches and cluster headaches, which is a whole other neurological indication that I won't go into right now. So we now have, Yale, Johns Hopkins, NYU, so, really major universities doing this, and that has a lot of cachet and convinces journalists and people, these are serious institutions. There's also a study going on now at Johns Hopkins this is not treatment, this is for long-term meditators to see how does psilocybin affect the quality of meditation. So they take psilocybin and do meditation, and they even go into an fMRI scanner and do 3 kinds of meditation, and how does it affect their practice, and that's got another year or 2. But most of them, and these meditators, I think, have never had psilocybin, I'm pretty sure. And they're saying it was their meditation experience under the influence of low-dose psilocybin, 10 milligrams, was easier, their clarity of mind was easier to attain, etc. And they felt it helped their meditation practice to give them sort of a marker like, okay, I can sort of learn how to get more in this mindful state or whatever. So they felt that psilocybin experience, under guides, helped them they liked their meditation practice better. It was easier. They found it more productive. So that's positive, but we don't have the data yet. And then there's a religious professional study for ministers, rabbis, imams, both at Johns Hopkins and NYU, and they're in the middle of that. And they want to look at how does a minister taking a psychedelic affect their work as a minister or a rabbi or whatever. So they're in the middle of that too. So that's pretty much what's going on in Europe and Switzerland, doing a lot of work with normal people. And one of the interesting studies was social exclusion. I'll explain this just because it's just an interesting study to me. So it's a normal person, and they're on psilocybin or not, or placebo, and they watch a video. It's more like a game, a video game, and there's two people playing catch, throwing a ball, and sometimes they throw it to me, the subject watching the screen, and so I throw it back. And after a while, they stop throwing it to me. So most people feel social exclusion, and that shows up on the fMRI scanner. If they're under the influence of psilocybin, they don't have that social exclusion experience, and it does not show up in the fMRI scanner. So psilocybin is somehow changing how the brain and personality reacts to the experience of being socially excluded, which is common to many psychiatric problems. So a lot of that research is getting very sophisticated. So any questions about the last research? I wanted to close. It's a few minutes of my own ideas, but yeah.
I just wanted to, in addition to other areas, do you know of any studies for dealing with like dementia or early onset Alzheimer's using psychedelics?
Yeah, there is a study planned at Johns Hopkins for early diagnosed Alzheimer's, not to treat the Alzheimer's disease itself. There's really no rationale that psychedelics would help prevent the memory loss from Alzheimer's. It's a completely different system in the brain. But getting a diagnosis of Alzheimer's is obviously a very traumatic experience. The patients are traumatized, their families are traumatized. So they're planning a study to treat the emotional distress of getting a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And they have most of the funding available. So, and actually it was the Alzheimer's Research Group at Johns Hopkins that came to the Psilocybin Research Group asking them to do that study. So the Alzheimer's researchers wanted to use psilocybin to help their terminally ill patients, with their emotional stress. So that's pretty neat that mainstream Alzheimer's researchers want to try psilocybin.
Hi. Thanks for all your work and research and informative talks on this. I was wondering if you knew of anyone doing research on the long-term side effects of maybe recreational use of such substances, and if you have any insights on where that's going.
Yeah, so NIDA, that's what they do. So they're doing all that, and I don't really keep up with it, but and you have to read it carefully and critically, and a lot of people use many drugs, not just one. But I can tell you one study was done in Utah with young Mormon people who went to raves, who had never had any drug in their life except MDMA. But doing it a lot, and they studied their memory, neuropsychological testing, and I don't know how frequently or whatever, but they found absolutely nothing abnormal about them whatsoever. Pure MDMA users, and maybe they didn't use 4 doses every day for every week for 2 years or something, but no neurological neuropsychiatric problems in that group. Okay, so this concludes this part of the talk.